Welcome back to the Principles and Elements of 2D Design lecture. This is part 2, Elements, where we'll discuss the 7 elements integral to the design process. And we're going to start with line. So line in design refers to a visual element of length. It is simply a point set in motion. Line is an element of design that defines shape, contours, and outlines. Line can also suggest mass and volume. It may be a continuous mark made on a surface with a pointed tool, or it can be implied by the edges of shapes or forms. Line can be used to add style, enhance comprehension, create forms, and divide space by being a border around other design elements. An expressive feature of line is its power of suggestion. Artists speak of line quality and use adjectives such as nervous, angry, free, quiet, uplifting, excited, calm, and graceful when describing how line works in artwork. When line is used to follow the edges of a form to describe their outlines, the result is called a contour drawing. Contour and line drawing defines shape and form by following the edges of forms visually describing the outlines. Cross contour occurs when a line appears to wrap around a form in a pattern that is at an angle to the outline of the form. Regardless of the chosen medium, when line is the main element of an image, the result is called a drawing. Lines can be straight or curved, thick or thin, rigid or organic, or horizontal or vertical, broken or continuous. Now, gesture is a line that does not stay at the edges but moves freely within forms. These lines record movement of the eye as well as implying motion in the form. When you're thinking of gesture drawing, it's rapid, it's active, it's almost as though the hand is an extension of your eye movement. Now, gesture drawings capture the energy of the subject. The drawings, again, are active. They capture the practice of the process of looking and doing. Gesture extends beyond contour, right? We're not carefully, slowly capturing the outline, but we're capturing the energy, the flow, and the movement within the subject. It is very loose, it is very quick. Describing shapes here is less important than showing the action or the dynamics of the pose. This type of drawing is almost always created quickly and spontaneously. Next time you're watching someone dancing or moving, just try rapidly and loosely just to capture the essence of that movement. So there's a few types of line we'll discuss. There's actual, implied, or psychic. Now, actual lines may vary greatly in weight, character, and other qualities. This is a line that you see. It's an actual line in that image to the left of my circle there. Those are that top row are 2 variations of actual lines. Implied lines are created by positioning a series of points so that the eye tends to automatically connect them and create movement across the picture plane. Sometimes these are also referred to as broken lines. Your eye will automatically create that enclosure of space and interpret that as a line, like those center dotted and broken lines. And then there's psychic lines. These are not real lines, right? They are cues that allow our eyes to follow a certain path that's created. We're creating a mental connection created by 2 different points or elements, right? That finger pointing to the dot, that's that's a psychic line. An object that looks and points in a direction, right? When we think back to that Andrew Wyeth painting from Principles, that figure was looking towards that farmhouse, so I know that I should be looking there as a viewer, right? Our eyes invariably follow. If we look at this painting on the left by Artemisia Gentileschi, those arrows are directional lines. They're not in the painting, but they're showing us that the direction of the 2 figures looking down at that beheading is telling us that that's where we should be looking, right? So these are psychic lines that draw our attention somewhere into the composition. We also have horizontal, vertical, diagonal lines. A horizontal line implies quiet and repose, right? It's like a body at rest. Horizontal refers to the horizon line. This is a reference for a level line. We see this as used in stability in architecture. A vertical line can be interpreted like a standing body. It has more potential of activity. A diagonal line almost always suggests some kind of motion. In so many of the active movements of life, we might consider walking, swimming, running, skating, the body is leaning. So we automatically see diagonals as indicating some kind of movement. We have also a psychological response to certain types of lines, and I'm sorry my bubble is breaking some of those, but curved lines can suggest comfort and ease. Horizontal lines, right? If we think of curved lines, we think of the legato or the curvilinear. Horizontal lines suggest distance and calm. We think back to that horizon or the repose, people at rest. Vertical lines suggest height and strength. We think about the height of a mountain. Jagged lines suggest turmoil or anxiety. Now, there's also different types of line quality, right? We might see emphasis, variety, or volume expressed through line quality. And these can help define three-dimensional forms on a two-dimensional surface. They create emphasis and transform a flat piece of paper into a spatial experience. Darker or heavier lines create emphasis on a light paper and draw that attention. And this helps to create volume in an image. There's also value that can be created by different uses of line. Cross-hatching is a really common way of creating this value. This is when a series of lines are put together to create visual areas of gray. They cross over each other often by varying the number of those lines and their proximity to each other. The artist can produce an almost infinite, limitless number of grays within a composition. Values then start to be built, areas of dark and areas of light that help pull out dimension into the form that is being created. If we look at the self-portrait by Kathy Kollwitz, we can see these almost gesture-like drawings used to outline the frame, kind of harder, darker lines. And then as we get into the inner proportions of the face, we can see that she's used cross-hatching, right? Lines crossing each other, or lines varying close proximity to create that sense of depth. And we see that the form of dimensionality of those different elements of the face, the nose, the mouth, the eyes, are starting to be pulled out from the flatness of the page by the use of creating value by cross-hatching lines. So line also is used to define a form when the contours of the image and subject matter are defined and the viewer eye is drawn to the edges of the various shapes. Varying line quality can create different spatial levels and shift areas of emphasis or visual interest. Line can be used to outline and create a form. Darker lines can be used to create emphasis in an image or color. Line can be used to define the contour of a form or shape and to suggest the form. If we look at this painting by Tracey Emin, without the use of line in that center of the image, it would look like an abstract painting with expressions of color. But that use of line defines a female form and a female figure that shifts the painting's composition, shifts the meaning of the painting and the intention. So this light use of line completely changes this painting from an abstract color painting to one that has a figure in its center. Now we'll move on to shape. A shape is a visually perceived area created either by an enclosing line or by color or value changes defining the outer edge. A shape can also be called a form. When referring to objects, form is the shape and structure of a thing. When referring to 2D artworks, form is the visual aspect of composition, structure, and the work as a whole. Our visual perception is dependent on our ability to recognize borders and boundaries that separate figure, right, foreground, from ground, background. The shapes we see are either a figure, an object or foreground element, or the ground, the space or the volume between the figures or the forms. You'll hear me talk about foreground and background a lot this term, and this is what we're referring to. A general rule of perception states that, as long as all other things are equal, our eyes tend to read convex shapes as figure, forward, advancing, and concave shapes as ground, background. Convex shapes are shapes that curve outward, and its middle is thicker than its edges, right? There's a visual volume that's created. Concave shapes are shapes that curve inward. They're hollowed out or rounded inward. Now, I talked just moments ago about volume, right? So we can start thinking about shape, volume, and mass in 2 dimensions. Now, 2-dimensional design or composition is basically the arrangement of shapes. In representational imagery, only the most diffused atmospheric images of light can be said to almost dispense with shape. Shape is usually considered a 2-dimensional element, and the words volume and mass are applied to 3-dimensional forms and equivalents. 2-dimensional artworks have shapes, and sculptures have masses. Now, in 2-dimensional works, volume is an illusion created by the artist to give the impression of weight or depth of an object that's occupying a particular space. So when we talked about those convex shapes that's creating this sense of volume, it's an illusion created by the artist to give an appearance of 3 dimensions. Now, we also see naturalism and idealism and distortion impact shape. Naturalism is concerned with appearance. It gives the true-to-life, honest visual appearance of shapes in the world around us. It's realism. In contrast, there is a specific type of artistic distortion called idealism. Idealism reproduces the world not as it is, but as cultural worldview says it should be. We can think about editing here. Naturalism is the skillful representation of the visual image, forms and proportions as seen in nature with an illusion of volume in 3 dimensions, right? We're trying to representationally create and depict an image as it is. Idealism is an artistic theory in which the work is not reproduced as it is, but as it should be. All flaws, accidents, and incongruities of the visual world are corrected. Distortion is exaggerated shapes that are stretched and altered in proportion. Natural proportions have been altered in a way that exaggerates features we easily recognize as out of proportion. Artists often use this to convey some kind of meaning or to communicate a message in their work. If we look at this image by Jenny Saville Propt, which type of technique do you think she's executed in this painting? Distortion, exaggerated shapes, idealism, or naturalism? We also see how shape plays into abstraction. So abstraction is a visual representation that may have little resemblance to the real world. Abstraction can occur through a process of simplification of distortion in an attempt to communicate an essential aspect of a form or concept. We see bimorphic shapes These are shapes that are derived from organic or natural forms. And then we have non-objective or pure forms. These are a type of artwork with absolutely no reference to or representation of the natural world. These are created shapes and form. The artwork is the reality. Some other types of shape and form we'll discuss and explore this semester are curvilinear, rectilinear, positive, and negative. So if we think about curvilinear, we can think back to legato. So curvilinear forms are ones that are rounded and curving, that tend to imply flowing shapes and compositions. Lines are also curvilinear. Rectilinear forms are composed of straight lines. The images reflect straight edges, right angles, and rectilinear patterns. Rectangular patterns. Rectilinear compositions can appear more manufactured and less organic. Lines are also rectilinear. Then we have positive and negative shape. A positive shape is a shape or an object distinguished from the background. These are often referred to as the foreground or the positive space of a composition. And then we have negative shape. This is a clearly defined shape within the ground that is defined by surrounding figures or boundaries. It's the shape around the shape. It's often referred to as the background or the negative space of a composition. Positive space, foreground, foreground image, primary object. Negative space, background, space around the space, space around the primary object. If we're looking at this painting, what do we think is the positive space here? And what do we think is a negative space? And how has the artist used positive and negative space in this composition? And then this brings us to the next element we'll discuss, pattern and texture. So pattern is the repetition of a visual element or module in a regular and anticipated sequence. Pattern can be intricate or simple. Pattern is a dynamic way of capturing visual interest and begins with a unit or shape that is repeated. It is common to find patterns based on plant designs and foliage in nature. Right now we're seeing an overlap here with unity. Textures are also characterized by repeated elements, but the variations usually do not involve such perfect regularity. Texture refers to the surface quality of objects. Texture appeals to our sense of touch. Even when we do not actually feel the object, our memory provides a sensory reaction or sensation of touch. A couple types of pattern, we have tessellation and fractal. So a tessellation is a pattern that has no gaps or overlap. The pattern is created through a predictable or periodic pattern by sliding or translating the design unit along an axis, tiling. A fractal is a form of pattern and repetition where a pattern is repeated at different scales within a structure, revealing a similarity at different scales. So a little bit about tactile texture. So tactile texture is the use of materials to create a surface that can be felt or touched. It's actual texture, tactile. There's a few different types of this. We have a bas-relief. This is a form of sculpture where the forms or figures emerge slightly from a flat wall or plane. We have impasto. This is a painting technique in which pigments are applied in thick layers or strokes to create a rough three-dimensional paint surface on a two-dimensional plane. We have collage. This is an artwork created by assembling and pasting a variety of materials on a two-dimensional surface. And then we have folk art. So folk art is quite broad and exists in all art forms. And this is arts and craft objects that are made by folks who haven't learned this art or craft through kind of a formal Western education system. It's often passed down in families or passed through communities. We also now have visual texture. So visual texture is the impression of texture on a flat, smooth painted surface. A two-dimensional illusion is suggestive of that tactile quality, but it's pure visual. And it's created by the artist to convey the representation of a felt surface. Now, I don't speak French, so I may mispronounce this, but trompe-l'œil is a French term meaning to fool the eye. The objects are in sharp focus and delineated with meticulous care to create an artwork that almost fools the viewer into believing that the images are actual objects. And then we have frottage or rubbings. This is a process of capturing a real texture by transferring that texture to paper, typically by rubbing loose graphite or charcoal on top of that paper. This is a really fun exercise. The top right image is some examples of rubbings that you should do when the weather's nice. Just find a really interesting surface. It could be the bark of a tree. It could be a really textured stone. I've seen people do this on sewer covers or grave markers. But take a piece of paper. Newsprint works really effectively because it's lighter weight, and put that over that surface and take your charcoal or graphite and then just rub until that texture starts to come through on your paper. It's a really fun exercise. If you do it, shoot me a message and I'll give you some extra credit, because I think it's just a really fun way to kind of mix nature and art making together. All right, next up, we're going to transition to illusion of space. So in art forms such as drawings, paintings, and prints, the artist who wants to convey a feeling of space or depth must translate clues from a three-dimensional experience to a two-dimensional plane. In this case, space is an illusion, as the images rendered on paper, canvas, or boards are essentially flat. When attempting to create a sense of visual depth, the artist considers both the two-dimensional plane and the many ways to suggest three-dimensional space. The various techniques used by the artist work to create a visual illusion of sense of space, depth, and dimension. All right, we're going to talk about what some of those tactics are, but using overlap, perspective, shading, scale, and placement all really help to create that dimension and space. So I want you to remember this image that we're seeing here on the right by Claire Barkley, and think about which tool Claire is using to create a sense of depth and space. So depth refers to the illusion of distance and three-dimensional space within a two-dimensional image. Even though drawings, paintings, photographs, and digital compositions exist on flat surfaces, again, artists use those different techniques to make images appear deep, layered, and spatially believable. Techniques such as overlap, scale changes, placement on the picture plane, value shifts, atmospheric perspective, and linear perspective all help create the illusion of depth. So if we think back to that Claire Barkley painting, what was she using? I saw a lot of overlap. These visual strategies guide the viewer through space and help establish relationships between objects, environments, and focal points. Some ways of creating depth is through size, exaggerated scale, overlap, and vertical location. So size is the easiest way to create an illusion of space or distance, right? Size difference conforms with our understanding of how we perceive space. A larger image in a composition appears closer to us, a smaller appears in the distance. That's how our visual perception works. Exaggerated scale is using relative sizes to give a feeling of space or depth. Overlap is a device for creating an illusion of depth in which shapes are in front of, partially hiding or obscuring others, right? This gives us the sense that something is in the foreground, something is in the background. And then there's vertical location. This is something that's not used a whole lot, but it's an interesting technique. It's a spatial device in which elevation on the page, higher up on the page, or format indicates a recession into depth. The higher up, the further back. The higher on the object, the farther back it is assumed to be. And this is all on the same plane. So those figures on the bottom are interpreted to be closer, and higher up are interpreted to be further behind. Now, perspective also helps us understand where objects exist in relation to one another and to the viewer. It allows artists to create the illusion that forms recede into space. They occupy physical environments and exist within believable spatial relationships. Even though a drawing, painting, photograph, or digital image is flat, perspective techniques help create the visual experience of depth and dimension. Artists use tools such as horizon lines, vanishing points, scale changes, overlap, and atmospheric effects to simulate the way we naturally perceive space in the world. Aerial or atmospheric perspective is one such tool. And this is a perception of less distinct colors and value contrast as forms recede into the background. Colors appear to be washed out in the distance and take on almost the color of the atmosphere. If you look out into the mountains, you will see this happening naturally. We also have linear perspective. This is a spatial system used in two-dimensional artworks to create the illusion of space. It is based on the perception that if parallel lines extend to the horizon line, they appear to converge and meet at a common point called a vanishing point. So the types of illusion of space through perspective that we're going to experiment with this semester are really 1-point and 2-point perspective, but I want to share a little bit about the different types of perspective that you'll explore if you continue on, especially with drawing. So 1-point perspective is a system of spatial illusion in two-dimensional art based on the convergence of parallel lines to a common vanishing point on the horizon. If you're looking down an empty road and all those lines meet at the center to 1 point that's back in the horizon line, that is 1-point perspective. 2-point perspective is a composition that is viewed through an angle with no objects parallel to the picture plane and with edges receding at 2 different points on the horizon line. If you're looking at the edge of a building and how those lines jet outward, that is 2-point perspective. Now there's multi-point perspective. This is a system of spatial illusion with different vanishing points at different sets of parallel lines. You might have 2 images. You might be looking at 2 different vantage points. Amplified perspective is a dynamic and dramatic illusionistic effect created where an object is pointed directly at the viewer. A fisheye lens can sometimes cause this. And then multiple perspectives. This is a depiction of an object that incorporates several points of view. If you look at some of M.C. Escher's work, he's very well known for creating these types of multiple perspectives. If we look at this image on the left here, Prudence Flint's painting, The Fitting, what kind of perspective do you think she is primarily employing? Is it 1 point, where everything's moving and meeting at 1 point, like an open road? Is it 2-point, where you're looking at the corner and the edge, and the points are meeting at 2 distinct points on the horizon line? Is it multi-point, amplified, or multiple? What do you think? And next we have 2 different types of composition and closure when we're thinking about creating an illusion of space. We have open form and closed form. Open form is the placement of elements in a composition so that they are cut off by the boundary of the design. It implies that the picture is a partial view of a larger scene, right? You're taking a snapshot of a much larger scene as though you took a viewfinder at one section of a larger painting. So you're only seeing a segment of the visual story. A closed form is a placement of objects by which a composition keeps the viewer's attention within the picture. A still life has been set up, and that still life exists and starts and ends within the bounds of that frame, right? There's no other story. It's not a snapshot. That's the whole scene. What do you think this painting, Seated Figure and Nude by Emma Amos, suggests? an open form, that there's more to the visual story here, we're only seeing a snapshot of it? Or is it closed? The entire story exists within the bounds of the frame. A hint to an open form is that the composition breaks the picture plane. Next up, we have illusion of motion. That's very much related to the principle of rhythm. So illusion of motion is an optical illusion in which a static image appears to be moving due to the cognitive effects of interacting color contrasts, object shapes, and position. Lines, shapes, space, and color can be used in a variety of ways to fool the eyes and brain to see movement that is not really there. Remember, we talked a little bit about kinesthetic empathy. So there's lots of different ways that we achieve this illusion of motion. Relative stillness and arrested action can be two different techniques. So relative stillness is motion and stillness in the universe and how they relate to one another. To determine whether an object is moving or stationary, a reference object must be first selected. In transient motion, this is a motion that's too rapid for the eye to perceive, so photography can help to capture the imagery of decisive or singular moment. If we look at this example on the left of relative stillness and transient motion, we're seeing that use of relativity within that composition. We visually interpret the stillness of people sitting on a train and that rapid motion of the environment passing them by through the use of photography to capture this as a singular moment. We also have anticipated motion. So this is where we start to think about how kinesthetic empathy is employed in two dimensions. So kinesthetic empathy is a mental process in which the viewer consciously or unconsciously recreates or feels an action motion that they only observe. It's like almost a physiological response, right? You feel that movement in your body from looking and observing movement. Now, anticipated movement is the implication of movement on static two-dimensional surface caused by the viewer's past experience with a similar action. If you're looking at a photograph of a runner and you yourself are a runner, you're going to anticipate that movement is occurring. We also have suggested motion, right? We can see techniques like repeated figure, cropped figure, multiple images, blurred outlines, or lines of force. Right? Repeated figures is a composition device in which a recognizable figure appears within the same composition in different positions as situations to relate a narrative to the viewer, right? So that use of repetition is telling a story. Cropping the figure is a dramatic design choice to convey motion by enhancing the feeling of action or movement. The figure is portrayed to be in mid-action. So we might see this like a jumper being, cut in half. Blurred outlines is a visual device in which most details and the edges of a form are lost in the rapidity of that implied movement, right? That's giving us the sense of this blurred visual image of someone running past. So we start to lose the details, the fineness of the image. Multiple image is a visual device used to suggest the movement that occurs when a figure is shown in a sequence of slightly overlapping poses in which each successive position suggests movement from the prior. Grouping similar subjects can also create movement across the grid, right? If we think about a grid and we think about almost like slow motion of like different screenshots of that figure in motion, and when you put those together, it's that figure like running or jumping. That's the use of multiple images to convey that sense of movement and action. And then lines of force. And these are lines that show the pathway of movement and a strong visual emphasis to suggest motion. Now, before I introduce this next kind of approach to illusion of motion, I want you to do an activity. So I want you to stare at the image of Amy Winehouse on the left for 30 seconds. And then after those 30 seconds are done, I want you to move to the pink square on the right. So I want you to hold your stare at the image on your left, and then after 30 seconds, move to the image on your right, and note what kind of after image appears in the pink square. I will hold time for you. And so we're gonna do 30 seconds starting now. Okay, that's our 30 seconds. So if you had stared right at Amy Winehouse for 30 seconds and then moved your eyes, shifted your gaze to that pink square, you would have seen the reverse after image onto that right square. Now, that's a typical reaction. Maybe you didn't experience that. So several techniques have been presented for capturing movement or depicting it in two-dimensional media. The understanding is that the static art and design forms, such as drawing, painting, prints, and graphic design, they don't actually move, but the eye can move, or the image on the retina can flicker, and graphic elements can induce these movements. Intense colors can also induce such eye movements as our eyes struggle to focus on different colors in that area, right? Think about vibrating colors. In addition to that, the retina will fatigue from exposure to a strong color, and as we glance away, like we just did, an after image will flicker. Okay, next up, we're approaching the end of our elements. So next up, we're going to talk about value. So value is the measure of relative lightness or darkness. The viewer's perception of the figure and ground depends on the relationships of light and dark. This is something else you're going to hear me talk a lot about, especially when I'm reviewing your sketchbook assignments. Pushing those lights and pushing those darks really helps pull out value, helps build dimensionality in two-dimensional artworks. So we have different varying values of light and dark. We have achromatic, value contrast, value pattern, and chiaroscuro. So achromatic is values of gray. It's mixtures of black, gray, or white, but there's no color or hue. Value contrast is the relationship between the areas of dark and light. A value pattern is the arrangement and amount of variation in light and dark values independent of any colors used. And chiaroscuro is Italian. It's the use of light and dark values to imply depth and volume in two-dimensional work of art. It's an Italian word that literally translates to light and dark, or light-dark. Now, if we look at this portrait series by Zanele Muholi, Muholi is an artist that really uses and pushes light and dark to create these really arresting, intense portraits, photographs. I see a combination of almost all of these techniques, achromatic, value contrast, value pattern, and chiaroscuro, in her works. There's this intensity of contrast between lights and darks. There's a value pattern that's happening with this achromatic scene, and she's pushing that chiaroscuro, that light and dark, really intentionally. Now, value and color are also related. Every color is in itself also simultaneously a certain value. Pure yellow is a light or high value color, corresponding to a very light gray in terms of light reflection. Purple is basically a dark, low value color that would match a very dark gray. A pure red will fall in the middle of the value scale. A value emphasis is the use of light and dark contrast to create a focal point within a composition. Like we can see how Sarah Ansis has used light and dark contrast and really emphasize that value to bring attention to that, the center part of that composition with the figure is writing on a note. High, dark, and light contrast instantly attracts the viewer's attention. By planning high contrast in one area and subdued contrast elsewhere, the artist can ensure where the viewer's eye will be directed to first. We're looking at what the figure is writing down. Now, value and space are also related. We learned a little bit about atmospheric perspective, and it shows up here in value. So value is used to create dimension. One of the most important uses of gradations of dark and light is to suggest volume or space. On a flat surface, value can be used to impart a three-dimensional quality to shapes. By varying the weight of the line, an artist may imply dimension or solidity, but the effect is subtle. When areas of dark and light are added, we begin to feel the three-dimensional qualities of the forms. Again, that aerial atmospheric perspective is related to value as well as illusion, as well as perspective. And this is the perception, again, of less distinct colors and value contrast as forms recede into the background. Colors appear to be washed out in the distance or take on the color of the atmosphere. Other techniques to adjust value is through shading, using a variety of media, cross-hatching, mixed media, or stippling. So shading is the use of building up value in artwork, layering that value on top of on top of itself in kind of smooth, no pattern, just building of the graphite or charcoal or whatever tool you're using through shading and layering. Now there's different media used to create value: pencil, charcoal, chalk, Conte, crayons, and different types of pastels. And these soft medias are capable of providing gradual changes. You can build upon themselves from dark to light. We talked a little bit about cross-hatching when we looked at Kathy Cowlitz. And this is a drawing technique in which a series of lines are layered over each other to build up value and to suggest form and volume. This example to the left shows this kind of clean application of cross-hatching at the front part of the thumb, and then this like gestured, rapid, kind of chaotic application of cross-hatching as the thumb extends to the top right of the page. Mixed media is a combination of two or more media in a single work of art, and this can be applied in a lot of different ways to create value. And then stippling is a creation of a pattern simulating varying degrees of solidity or shading by using just small dots. So the closer in proximity the dots are, the darker the value, right? So you're using those dots instead of line or shading to build up the value on top of itself. Now, this is the last part of our elements, and this is the longest section, and it makes sense. There's an entire course on color design and color theory, and so this will give us just an introduction to how color is used in design. So color is a property of light. It is not an object itself. Objects, in fact, have no color on their own, but merely the ability to reflect certain wavelengths of light. Blue objects absorb all the wavelengths except the blue ones, and these are reflected to our eyes. Black objects absorb all the wavelengths. White objects reflect them all. The significance of this fact for the artist is that as light changes, color will change. And when we talk about color, we're talking about colors that can be perceived by the human eye. Several different animals and life forms have different types of color vision. Humans have different types of color vision, or lack of color vision. So this is the typical perception of color that could be seen by the typical human eye. So there's a couple different systems. We see additive or subtractive. Now, additive is a color mixing system in which combinations of different wavelengths of light create a visual sensation of colors. Additive color mixing uses light to create color. Combining different colored lights creates new colors. So when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about how color is present on computer screens or televisions or at the movies. Subtractive system is a color mixing system in which pigments, actual physical substances, are combined to create visual sensations of color. Wavelengths of light absorbed by the substance is subtracted, and the reflected wavelengths constitute the perceived color. Subtractive color mixing uses pigments like paint, ink, or dye. Colors are created by absorbing some light and reflecting others back to our eyes. Painting, printing are examples of subtractive systems, right? This is actual versus light-based or implied. Now, our perception of colors change according to their surroundings. Even in the same light, a color will appear different depending on the colors that are adjacent to it, right? Color perception is something that I'll talk about a lot because individuals will perceive color, the same color, differently. I might look at a color and think it's pink. Someone else might look at that color and think it sits more purple. Color is about perception. As light changes, the color we observe will also change. If we look to that image on the left, the gray boxes inside the green and purple, the gray is affected perceptively by the colors around it. It is the same color of gray, but if you look at it, you may see one gray as darker or lighter than the other. Now, color constancy is a psychological compensation for changes in light when observing a color. In this instance, a viewer interprets the color to be the same under various light conditions. The constancy effect is an aspect of human perception that allows us to see a color or form as consistent even if circumstances change appearances. Now we're going to talk a little bit about hue and color properties. Hue is a property of color defined by distinctions within the visual spectrum or the color wheel. Red, blue, yellow, and green are examples of hues. Now, the spectrum is the range of visible color created when white light is passed through a prism. And we're talking again about the human typical visual spectrum. The color wheel is an arrangement of colors based on a sequence of hues in the human visible spectrum. It is the most common organization for the relationships of basic colors that we'll discuss. And then there's three different ways of discussing colors. There are primary colors, the three colors from which all other colors theoretically can be mixed. These primary pigments are traditionally red, yellow, and blue. Secondary are mixtures of two primaries. So red and yellow make orange, secondary color. Yellow and blue make green, secondary color. And blue and red make violet, secondary color. And then there's tertiary colors. These are a mixture of a primary and an adjacent secondary to make a tertiary. Blue and green make blue-green. Red and violet make red-violet, and so on. So within hue and color properties, we have perceived color relationships, right? The hue, again, are the colors of the spectrum or the color wheel. The value is the relative lightness or darkness, this time applied to color. And the intensity or chroma, and this it's called chroma within the Munsell color chart. This, if you take color design at UAA, this is the system that is likely being referenced. But this is the relative saturation of a perceived color. So if you've ever adjusted your images from like a phone color and you've adjusted the saturation, that's the intensity or chroma. So within those color properties of value, we have value, which is the lightness or darkness of a hue. We have a tint. So a tint of color is lightening a color by adding white to it. We have shade. A shade of a color is adding black to darken a color. Some other techniques for adjusting the value of a color are adding gray. This will neutralize or lower the intensity or saturation of a color. You can also mix a color with its color complement. A color complement is the color directly across from it on the color wheel. Neutralized or lower intensity versions of colors are called tones. Now, there's also different types of visual color mixing. So visual color mixing is when two pure colors are placed side by side in small areas, so the viewer's eye will do the mixing. The pure colors are only mixed in perception. They're not actually overlapping or blended. They're side by side, but our eyes will blend them. There's also optical mixing, which is color mixtures created by the eyes as small bits of color are perceived to blend and form a mixture. If we look at this painting by Chuck Close, and if we were to zoom in on that, each grid on this large painting is a different color, shape, and form. When we zoom out, our eye blends those individual grids to create a face. But there's no actual blending to create this image. You zoom in, each grid is a totally independent color and shape to its next, but our vision, we have a visual color mixing and optical mixing creating this likeness of a face. And then there's also pointillism, or sometimes called divisionism. And this is using small bits of juxtaposed color to produce different color sensations. Pixelated images are an example of this. Now, cool and warm colors apply visual sensation to color. Colors can have a psychological effect on the senses and can be used as attention getters in artworks. Our cool tones are our blues and greens. Our warm tones are our reds and oranges and yellows. Dominant colors can create visual interest. Color can also help us achieve balance in artworks when the value has little contrast. And warm colors advance visually while cool recede, right? So sometimes using a color like red or orange in advertising might make that object pop out to the viewer, while a blue sky in the background will make that background recede, right? So using that when you want to build contrast or emphasis is a really important strategy. Now, color schemes are also referred to as color harmonies, and there are any one of a number of color relationships based on groupings within the color wheel. There's monochromatic color scheme, which is using only one hue. The hue can vary in value, and pure black or white may be added. There's analogous color schemes. This is combining several hues that sit right next to each other on the color wheel. And there's tonality, the dominance of a single color or the visual importance of a hue that seems to dominate the whole color structure despite the presence of other colors. We also see complementary and triadic colors. So complementary colors are colors opposite each other on the color wheel. Each color's complement is the one directly across from each other. And then there's triadic. This is a color scheme involving three hues equally spaced on the color wheel, like the example to the right below. We talked a little bit about vibrating colors. It appears here. When we think about discordant colors, so a discordant color note in a painting or design may contribute kind of a visual surprise. It may have a different sensation, and sometimes it's used to express a really particular idea. So color discord is a combination of discordant colors, colors that don't go together. Vibrating color, again, is that effect created by two conflicting colors that occur when opposite colors of the same value are paired next to each other, causing that visual flicker effect. Some other types of color uses we'll encounter are local or optical color, heightened color, arbitrary color, or emotional color. Now, local or optical color is the identifying color perceived in ordinary daylight. It's how the thing looks in normal lighting. Arbitrary color are colors chosen by the artist to express feelings or moods. These are not realistic. They are chosen by the artist for whatever they're trying to convey. Heightened color is a hue in a representational or abstracted picture that is intensified beyond natural appearance, right? So it's an intensified use of color. And then emotional color. So colors that evoke an emotional response, like feeling blue or seeing red, right? These are different emotional uses of color. And a lot of that relates to color symbolism, right? Color symbolism employs color to signify human character traits or concepts. Color can symbolize abstract concepts or ideas, fidelity, sin, innocence, or cowardice. The colors chosen to symbolize various ideas are often arbitrary, or the initial reasons for their choice have become so deeply buried in history we no longer remember them. In Renaissance paintings, we see blue often used when the Virgin Mary was represented, or purple was this color of royalness. Symbolic references are cultural. They are not the same worldwide, but vary from one society to another. In some cultures, black is the color of mourning. In other cultures, white is the color of mourning. In our current era, symbolic color designations are associated with political, religious, and commercial messages. So, the elements and principles of design are more than just rules or vocabulary terms. They are the visual tools artists and designers use to communicate ideas, emotions, movement, atmosphere, and meaning. Once you begin recognizing them, you start seeing them everywhere in art, advertising, film, fashion, architecture, social media, and everyday life. Learning these concepts gives you a stronger visual language and helps you become a more intentional creator and a more critical viewer. So now that we've explored the foundations of visual language, the next step is experimentation. The best way to understand these concepts is not just to memorize them, but to actively use them, to test them, combine them, and discover how they function through making. So as you work through this course and do your sketchbook exercises and start to work on your final project, please reach out and let me know if anything doesn't make sense or you have any questions. I wish you the best of luck and happy art making.